What if I told you a story that people repeated for 2,000 years was never true at all? Not a little exaggerated, not slightly mistaken, but completely built on an idea that sounded so good, no one bothered to check it. You might think fake stories only go viral today, but history proves we have always been fooled by the tales we want to believe. That is exactly what this video exposes. Imagine this. You are standing in a crowded ancient marketplace. Statues loom above your head. Priests chant in marble halls, and everyone around you swears they know the truth of the world. They teach it to their children. They carve it into stone. They build temples around it. And they are wrong. That is not just a metaphor. That is exactly what happened. Before we dive deeper, do a quick thing for the algorithm and for this channel. Hit subscribe and drop a comment telling me where you are watching from. Now let us pull apart a myth that fooled empires, scholars, and schoolbooks and show you the evidence that cracked it open. The story begins with one of the most persistent beliefs in the entire ancient world. It appeared in Rome and Greece in early medieval writing, and even in some history textbooks well into the 19th century. The myth claimed that ancient peoples believed the world was held up by a massive figure or creature. Sometimes it was a titan named Atlas, sometimes it was a cosmic elephant, sometimes a giant turtle, depending on the culture. The problem: almost no ancient cultures actually believed that in the way later people assumed. The legend was kept alive, not by the people who supposedly started it, but by storytellers centuries later. Let us take the most famous version, the Titan Atlas. You probably picture a muscular giant straining under a globe, because art and cartoons hammered that image into our heads. Even statues built in modern times show him carrying the planet. But here is the twist. The oldest Greek sources never said Atlas held up the earth. Writers like Hesiod explained that Atlas held up the sky, not the earth, the celestial dome, not the planet. As centuries passed, artists switched it without noticing. Then Renaissance sculptors cemented the error, and suddenly kids grew up believing Greek mythology pictured the world resting on Atlas' shoulders. Reality was rewritten by accident. That is only one layer of the myth, but the stranger part is how it spread. Roman writers repeated it. Medieval Christian scholars mentioned it. Enlightenment thinkers mocked it. And every single time the fake version sounded so dramatic that it replaced the original without resistance. That is how myths work. They do not need accuracy. They need emotional punch. Now let us look at another part of the same long-lived lie. For centuries in both Europe and parts of the Islamic world, people claimed that ancient civilizations thought the earth was flat and held up by animals or gods. You have heard the joke about the world sitting on the back of a turtle, and when someone asks what the turtle stands on, the answer is turtles all the way down. Funny but wrong. Most ancient astronomers, especially in Egypt, Greece, India, and Mesopotamia, knew the earth was round. They used shadows and stars to prove it. The myth of flat earth thinking in ancient times was mostly invented much later by writers who wanted to make the past look foolish. Only in a few isolated traditions were poetic metaphors turned into literal cosmology. But people today repeat it like a historical fact. So how did a completely false belief become immortal? The answer involves power, faith, and repetition. When a story serves a purpose, people hold on to it, even if it is wrong. For Roman emperors, Greek philosophers, and later religious authorities, the myth of Atlas and similar tales offered a comforting, symbolic map of the universe. Holding up the heavens meant holding up order. Civilization itself seemed to rest on his shoulders. That metaphor became literal over time. Then it became a truth in popular memory. Fast forward to the era of colonial explorers, Renaissance artists, and early encyclopedias. They found scraps of old myths, misunderstood them, drew them, and reprinted them with confidence. A single engraving of Atlas holding a globe on his back circulated across Europe and later the Americas, and that was enough to overwrite ancient cosmology in the public mind. No one checked the original Greek texts until much later. By then, the fake version had gone viral for centuries. Now let us bring in the smoking gun. What finally killed the myth was not skepticism, but translation. In the 19th century, when scholars translated Hesiod and other classical writers more accurately, They realized Atlas was never described as holding up the earth. The text said he stood at the edge of the world holding the sky on his shoulders. Suddenly historians saw how the mix-up happened. Artists and second-hand storytellers had replaced heavens with earth, and most people never noticed until it was too late. Here is where the myth gets even stranger. Even after scholars corrected the record, the fake version refused to die. Today you can search Atlas' statue and see almost every image showing him with the planet instead of the sky. A completely wrong idea outlived kings, languages, and empires. Why? Because the mind holds on tighter to vivid images than to footnotes. But this is not just about Atlas. Here is another twist. Ancient Hindu cosmology is often laughed at today, with claims that people believed the Earth rode on elephants, standing on turtles. This version was exaggerated and often mistranslated. The images were symbolic representations, not literal scientific claims, but European writers spread the literal interpretation because it made them feel intellectually superior to earlier cultures. Another fake truth that became accepted for generations. In many history classes, students were told that people in the Middle Ages or ancient times thought ships could fall off the edge of the Earth. Yet maps from the era show spherical world views, navigation techniques reflect curved Earth calculations, and philosophers debated latitude with math. That is reality. But the myth stuck because it makes for a dramatic story. A fake story survived for centuries, just like Atlas. So what are we really learning here? The biggest myths do not survive because they are believable. They survive because no one thinks to challenge them. And the longer a lie lives, the harder it is to kill. Even when evidence piles up in museums, libraries, and archaeological digs, the wrong version can keep circulating in documentaries, cartoons, and cheap textbooks. Now let us add the final punch. You probably assume misinformation spreads faster now because of the internet, but think about this. A single artistic misunderstanding in the Renaissance lasted 500 years. That is more staying power than most online conspiracies today. The ancient world did not write this myth. The modern world did, and then blamed the ancients for it. Why does this matter? Because myths that pretend to be facts shape how we see human history. When we repeat them, we erase the real achievements of ancient astronomers, engineers, and philosophers. The people we imagine were primitive or silly were often more accurate than the people who mocked them 2,000 years later. Now picture this moment. An archaeologist in the early 20th century opens a storage cabinet in Athens and finds a small clay tablet. It contains the earliest depiction of Atlas, not with a globe but with stars above him. That discovery was barely noticed at first, because the myth was too big to challenge. But it was the first crack. Years later, papyrus fragments and pottery confirmed the same thing. Lines of text describing the heavens being pushed upward, not the earth being balanced. Archaeologists and historians presented the findings and the academic world adjusted, yet the public never really caught up. The myth had become entertainment, not history. So here is the hidden lesson. The myth that survived 2,000 years did so, not because ancient people were dumb, but because modern people get attached to simple stories. We prefer dramatic images over careful study. That is how a fake belief can become immortal. Now you know the truth. The next time you hear someone joke that the ancients thought the world sat on a giant turtle, or that Atlas carried the earth, ask them where that idea came from. Chances are they do not know, and neither did the people who spread it in the first place. If you want more stories that expose the lies we inherited, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling me which myth you want investigated. Next, ancient weapons, cities that never existed, lost civilizations. I am reading them all right now. And remember, sometimes the only thing older than a myth is the mistake that keeps it alive.